As many.
Thank you
The
very
chair
much.
recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy. Mr. Deputy, I listened to the remarks by the member for Fox Hill, and at least with respect to the position with the banks in the Family Islands, I support the comments that you were making. I believe that I can't believe any of us would not support those comments. While you are in government, I believe you have an opportunity to do something about it. And the question is whether you have the will and the support to be able to put into action those comments that were made. And I think if you were able to convince your colleagues that action should be made, we would support it. We would support it. Mr. Deputy, the Central Bank Amendment Bill is an attempt to legalize and to legitimize a fundamentally unlawful act perpetrated by the Davis administration. We on this side will not support or endorse such an act. In August of 2021, 1 month before the election, the Bahamas receives 247 million SDR allocation to bolster external reserves. This was the line, or this was the headline that was reported from the Central Bank of the Bahamas. The Central Bank reported publicly and communicated to the Ministry of Finance the following, and this is I'm speaking about in August of 2021. The Central Bank, and I'm quoting from their release, the Central Bank intends to use the SDR's allocation for foreign reserve management operations. In particular, holding them available for any increase in foreign exchange needs expressed through public and private sectors. So the Central Bank in August decided that they would take possession of these SDRs and that they would allocate the SDRs for foreign reserves. They go further in their release, though, and it takes us to why we are here today. And this is again from the Central Bank. The Bahamas' SDR allocation are not being earmarked for lending to the government and do not increase the central bank's ability to lend to the government. The lending limits remain fixed by law. This is what the central bank said at the time, in August of 2021, at the time the SDRs, they took possession of the SDRs. They said they are not earmarking it for lending to the government and do not increase the central bank's ability to lend to the government. So as far as the central bank is concerned, once they took possession of those SDRs, which they said they were going to allocate for their foreign reserves, the only way the government could use it is to lend it to the government. as far as the central bank is concerned, from their own release. However, these allocations improve space from the central bank to relax the remaining foreign currency conservation measures. The Central Bank Act provides under Section 21 that the central bank only permits the bank to offer short-term loans, and here's the important point that the central bank's lawyers picked up on. Short-term loans and direct or indirect advances to the government. And they are prevented from making those indirect or direct advances to the government only in certain circumstances.
The chair recognizes the honourable member for Fox Hill.
Sorry. Well, I know it's not question time, but the member yielded.
Go ahead.
So what I'm trying to understand is, if you go one step beyond that, though, beyond where you were, not starting at the central bank, is it not correct that the IMF itself made a particular point about these monies that were advanced to the central bank? Right. So let's hear that story. Okay.
Thank you, honourable member.
Get to that. I can get to that. Yeah, there are, but I'm giving mine. Yeah. The Central Bank Act, Section 21, prevents, stops, you cannot, short-term loans and indirect or direct advances to the government only under certain circumstances. Now, what you are doing today, the amendment that you are making today, is to say that the SDRs do not form a part of Section 21, that Section 21 does not apply to the SDR allocation. So if you are, through this amendment, saying that the SDRs are not a part of Section 21, then it goes without saying that right as we stand today, Section 21 prevents you from drawing down on those allocations. In fact, Section 21, subsection 1 says that aside from the limited exceptions noted above, the central bank shall not make any direct or indirect advances to the government or any state-owned enterprise. Mr. Deputy, the Prime Minister referred to the frequently answered questions, or frequently asked and answered questions. So I wish to refer you to the actual IMF guidance notes. The actual IMF guidance notes require that member states follow their own domestic law in making use of the SDR allocation. So the IMF says, here is what you could use these allocations for. But in deciding what you are going to use the allocation for, you must take into account your domestic law and whether your domestic law allows you to do what you want to do. So you can't just use the guidance notes by itself. You must use the guidance notes because the guidance note says, check your domestic law first. It is subject to what your domestic law says. So, Mr. Deputy, the argument that the SDRs could be used by the government is dependent upon the law that allows it to happen. So until Parliament makes this amendment, until they pass this amendment, that's both houses, until you pass this amendment, what you are doing is still contrary to Section 21 of the Central Bank Act. I go further. The IMF guidance notes that I refer to is, and it was referred to by the leader, under Section 27 of the IMF guidance notes. And here's what Section 27 says. A member's decision on the on-lending arrangements should be informed by the financial autonomy considerations of their central bank. Is the central bank independent? Is the central bank separate and apart from the government? Or is the central bank a part of the government? These include, one, whether the on-lending balances fall into the statutory limits or prohibitions on the credit to the government. Now, remember what was said before by the governor of the central bank. He says these are set for the reserves of the country. They are not meant for on lending to the government because our lending restrictions have not changed. They are governed by law. So as far as the governor of the central bank is concerned, or as far as the central bank was concerned back in August of 2021, they could not do it because they were limited by law. This is what the guidelines say. These include whether the on-lending balances fall within the statutory limits or prohibitions on credit to the government. Also look at footnote 22, right below that. For the purposes of this note, on-lending is described as the central bank's lending to the government agencies the proceeds from the exchange of SDRs for freely usable currency, consistent with the domestic, legal, and institutional framework. Again, it says, yes, you could use this for these particular reasons. You could either use it for your reserves, or you can lend it to the government. But it is still subject to what your own domestic law says. What is your domestic law's lending limits? Central banks may face restrictions, and this is what is in the guidelines. This is not something that we are making up. This is what is actually in the IMF guidelines. It says central banks may face restrictions or may altogether be prohibited to lend to the government in perpetuity, which in our case, the central bank under Section 21 prevents the advances, indirect or direct advances to the government only in certain circumstances. Staff advice, and I'm again reading from the central bank's guidance notes, staff advice should thus strongly emphasize the importance of ensuring that any fiscal use of the SDR allocation be consistent with domestic institutional frameworks and procedures. So they are saying, regardless of what the IMF says you could use this for, check your own domestic law first and see whether or not you are allowed to, and what are the restrictions that are being placed on it. We find that in the Central Bank Act. I would suggest Section 21 of the Central Bank Act. Mr. Deputy, I wish to remind you again, I spoke to the Central Bank Act provides under Section 21, which says that you are prevented from taking advances, indirect or direct, except under those specific circumstances. Mr. Deputy, we know that the press reports that the government and the Ministry of Finance executed a MOU to explain the entire situation. That was referred to by the leader. It was also spoken about by the Prime Minister. The MOU between the government and the central bank is very, very telling. The government received advice from the central bank's external lawyers that this transaction was unlawful. It is also my belief that the central bank would not proceed with the transaction unless this amendment was actually proceeded with. They said, we can have you sign an MOU, and in that MOU, you are going to commit to putting in place this amendment. The Memorandum of Understanding signed by the Prime Minister and the Governor of the Central Bank says this, and I quote, based on the advice of its external legal counsel, the bank is of the view that one, using the 2021 SDR allocation for the purpose would create a liability from the government to central bank. That it is undeniable that what is happening here creates a liability on the government, or creates a liability on central bank to the government. But notwithstanding Section 4(6) of the Act, and then 2, a position could be taken, which we in this place take that position, a position could be taken that the government would have exceeded the authorization borrowing limits set forth by Section 21. So the very same position that I spoke about, the very same position that the leader spoke about, that all of us on this side have spoken about, saying you have exceeded your borrowing authority under the Central Bank Act by doing this, is the very same point that the external lawyers who advised the central bank said, and they put it in their Memorandum of Understanding. I don't know who their lawyer is.
Don't answer the questions, eh?
But Mr. Deputy, we on this side heard about, when we on this side heard about the transaction, this is precisely the position that we have been speaking about.
Yes.
When we heard about it, it's precisely what we said. They were advised of it, and we also were advised of the same point. And the government knew full well about this position. They signed it knowing full well what the legal position was. Now I go further. In April of 2022, the IMF, in their review of the Bahamas, when the IMF spoke about the Bahamas, this is what they said about the SDRs. They said the authorities plan to keep the SDRs as reserves, given legal limits on central bank lending to the government. So the IMF acknowledged that there are limits, there are legal limits, and so they're going to stay as reserves. So what you are doing again is contrary to what Section 21 allows you to be able to do. The authorities plan to keep the SDRs as reserves, given the legal limits on the central bank lending to the government, which, and here's the other part that they said, which is appropriate given the uncertain balance of payment outlook. They say this is what the central bank says. They can leave it there. Because of the legal limits, they can leave it there. And we believe that it is an appropriate thing to do given the balance of payment outlooks. Now we move to December of 2022. In the central bank's review of economic and financial developments, this is what the central bank says. Preliminary estimates reveal that during the second quarter of the financial year 2022-2023, the government's overall deficit widened relative to the comparative quarter of 2021-2022. Let's stop right there. In essence, they're saying the deficit got bigger this year than it was last year in that second quarter of the year. Underlying this term, or underlying this outturn, spending recovery paced faster than the VAT-led growth in revenue. You spent more than you were making. This is again in the central bank. This is again in the central bank's report. Buoyant by improving economic conditions. Budgetary financing was mainly obtained from internal sources and a drawdown of the IMF special drawing rights. You overspent. You spent more than you made. Yes. It created a vacuum. It created an issue. It created a larger deficit than you anticipated. And you needed to fill that deficit. So what do? I go ahead and take the funds from the central bank, take the SDRs from the central bank, which belong to the central bank. It belonged to the central bank until there was an agreement to lend to the government.
That's correct.
It belonged to the central bank until there was an agreement to lend to the government.
That's correct.
And let me then go further, Mr. Deputy. The MOU states expressly that it is expressed. What the MOU states was that you must include in this amendment, it must expressly exclude the 2021 SDR allocation and the use and subversion of the SDR allocation for this or for the purpose. So what the central bank, what the MOU spoke about was that once you change the law to allow for the 2021 allocation, then we're fine. But you went a little further. You actually changed the law not just for the 2021 allocation, but you changed the law for the 2021 allocation and all other allocations going forward. So,
Access to everything.
what you again have not taken into account, or you may have taken into account and may have decided otherwise, but as far as the central bank was concerned, just deal with the 2021, but you have decided, I'm going to deal with the 2021, and I'm going to go further. All other allocations that the IMF prepares from now on until onward, you are now able to do it. Mr. Deputy, the Bahamian people have yet to receive a satisfactory answer from this government as to why it decided to circumvent the law and access the country's external reserves in the SDRs held by the central bank. These SDRs reside, as I submit, they resided on the balance sheet of the central bank as detailed in the bank's most recent audited financial statements. They are not and have never been the property of the central bank, or sorry, of the central government for reasons that are well known and are well understood. Mr. Deputy, let me read that again
Order, members.
so that it is abundantly clear.
Say it again.
Let me read that again.
Give us protection,
They
please, Mr.
are not,
Order, members.
they are not, and have never been the property of the central government for reasons which I have said before.
Yeah.
The Central Bank Act of section 17 of the Central Bank Act, subsection 2(4), unequivocally states that the IMF's SDRs are a part of the official external reserves of the central bank. So in the Central Bank Act, it says that when these SDRs come out, they then form a part of the external reserves, which is why the governor of the central bank in 2021 was absolutely right at the time when he said, these belong to the central bank to put towards the external reserves. It bolstered the external reserves. And they are not meant for on lending to the government. Clearly, the government was caught red-handed and is now bringing this legislation in an attempt to wipe the slate clean
Yes.
from their breaking the law.
Yeah.
In fact, that you are bringing this now and making it retroactive to December is only proof that you broke the law. In December, what this amendment does is this amendment cleans up what you did back in December. If it didn't, why make it retroactive to December? So, Mr. Deputy, as I take my seat, it is abundantly clear that we, on this side, cannot support what is happening here today. It is a breach of Section 21 of the Central Bank Act. What it does is it cleans up or attempts to clean up, attempts to make legitimize, to make legal the unlawful act that took place back in December. The release of the central bank back in 2021 says that it would break the law.
Yes.
The MOU says that it would break the law, so you must do this. We on this side says that you broke the law back in 2022, December of 2022.
As is your custom.
And so you have, again, consistently been consistent in terms of the ways in which you break the law. Now, Mr. Deputy, in my 2 minutes, there are some very quick East Grand Bahama matters that I would wish to raise. The first is the nurses. There is a need, member for Tall Pines, there is a need for a full-time nurse in Sweetingski. We have spoken about this on many occasions, and every time I go to Sweetingski, I am reminded that they are still waiting the necessary changes to the nurses' facility in order for that full-time nurse to be there. They are also waiting for the full-time nurse in the High Rock Clinic. The full-time nurse has to travel from Freeport to High Rock, and then also has to travel from High Rock to McLeanstown and to Sweetingski. And what they informed me was that they are only awaiting for the ministry's approval to put her in a place that has already been allocated, that has already been there. I was saying that that's what has been advised to me. But there is a place that, I am told there is a place that is there, and that they are, it is ready for the person to go in. Also, they have now been told that residents who go to who go to the clinics, particularly High Rock, now have to pay. And I understand that all other places in the Bahamas, or most other places in the Bahamas and other clinics, you also have to pay, but they are now being informed that you have to pay. And these are residents, these are elderly residents who are in desperate need of these medical facilities, and unfortunately, many of them may not be in a position to pay. And we hope that they are not being turned away if they are not able to pay. And so given the fact that there is not a full-time nurse that's there, given the fact that these residents are still, many of them still recovering from Hurricane Dorian, still in a desperate situation, they are now being told that they have to pay. Also, member for Western and Bimini, we are eagerly awaiting the opening of the office, the social services office and the urban renewal office. I know that at one point there was a call that was said that we were going to, y'all were going to open it, but that was postponed. So we are eagerly awaiting when that is going to happen, as well as the member for Pinewood. Also, we were told that a national insurance office was also going to be opened in East Grand Bahama. And so we are awaiting what the status of that opening up the office in East Grand Bahama also is going to be. We also were informed that, there was a big meeting, and I wrote down everything that you all said at the big meeting. I did. I wrote it down because I believed that I was going to have to come back and remind you about all the promises that you all made at that big meeting. And so we also are awaiting the opening of the preschool that you said was going to happen months and months ago. You said a preschool was going to happen. You even called the name of the church that you were going to open the preschool in.
Honorable member,
This was,
20 minutes later.
yeah, you got 2 minutes.
thank you. This was, I understand you were not there. You were not there, and I will speak to you offline as to who went in the public meeting and spoke on your behalf.
Your deputy.
But there was some people who went in the meeting and who said that this was going to happen. In fact, they didn't just spoke about the preschool happening at a particular church. They also spoke about a primary school that was supposed to happen. And again, I understand you weren't there, so I'm not holding you to that. But I hold the person who said it to it, because they went and they told the people that. I pointing all over. But Mr. Deputy, also in the DRA also, we were also told in the DRA about all of the houses that were going to be repaired and built. Repaired and built. And so, unfortunately, we are still awaiting when these houses are going to be repaired, and we are most definitely waiting when these houses are going to be rebuilt. So, Mr. Deputy, East Grand Bahama, as was said by our leader, East Grand Bahama does not support the Central Bank Amendment Bill.
Thank you, honorable member.